Hey YouTube, welcome to Rampage Reviews. I'm Rampage, and we are going back to another story taking place before the Phantom Menace that really rehumanizes the Jedi, and I really had a lot of fun with it. Let's dive in. So today we're reviewing Star Wars The Living Force, and it's written by John Jackson Miller. It takes place 33 years BBY, so just a year before the events in The Phantom Menace. Usually with stories that take place right before or right after official episodes, it might seem like something that's going to expand on what leads up to that episode or what immediately follows that episode, the official stories anyway. This one was just a fun side story, a fun read that has some things that feel out of place, but it was still a fun story to read and really enjoyed it. And like I said, it really humanized the Jedi to where they didn't feel that way before, because a lot of times the Jedi, especially in the High Council, feel like they're robotic. Yoda can sometimes feel like that, Ki-Adi-Mundi, especially Mace Windu, probably the most robotic of them. As much of an awesome character he is, he can feel a little bit robotic. Before I continue, I just want to let everybody know that if you wanted to purchase this book, there will be a link in the description for this book, as well as the next 3 books that I'll be reading. There was a small mistake. I had Rise of the Red Blade in the links that I would be including later, and I did a little research and realized that's not going to take place until after episode 3, so I had to move that one way back, just so I could stay in chronological order. So the next book will be Brotherhood after this one. You'll be able to purchase those books if you click those links. However, I am an Amazon affiliate, so if you do use the links, it will benefit me and the channel in some way, but don't do it to benefit me. Do it so we can continue this conversation. I love it. And also, if you like the content that you're about to see today, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. So there's a few things taking place in the story that happened. One thing that's taking place is there's a planet called Kwenn that a lot of the Jedi Council had talked about in a nostalgic way, and they were doing so because they were reviewing the closures of Jedi Outposts across the galaxy, and they were doing that because Qui-Gon had let them know that on a trip with Obi-Wan on a vessel called the Regal Zephyr, which there's different Regal vessels, but there's the Regal Zephyr, the Regal Voyager, and others. He had spoken to a lot of people that were coming from a planet that had just experienced a recent Jedi Outpost closure. They were talking about the Jedi as if they just didn't care. They didn't ever see them around helping people. Public perception, especially in small communities, was that the Jedi were not there for the common person. They were holed up on Coruscant, and they only dealt with big picture ideas, and they rarely ever took interest in small communities and individual communities. Qui-Gon took that personally because he's very much a believer of the living force, the name of the book. He believes that you should be taking care of issues that are in the moment right in front of you, where the force is speaking to you immediately. That's something that he has disagreed with Yoda on several times, because Yoda is more about the universal force, how to affect things on a grander scale, which is kind of what the High Council is for. But Qui-Gon challenged the High Council to do something to just help one person. They had discovered the planet Kwenn on this list of places that were slated to have a Jedi Outpost closure, and they decided, you know what, we should go there and we should hold a celebration, and maybe during the celebration we might change our minds on whether that Jedi Outpost is needed there or not needed, because their resources are also stretched thin, just like a lot of other people in the galaxy. They need to use their people wisely and strategically to make sure they're making the most impact in the places that need it the most. So they ultimately decide to leave the council chambers to visit Kwenn and hold a celebration that celebrates the 200th anniversary of the Grand Renewal that John Jackson Miller lays a little tiny pre-story to it, where it took place in the High Republic. They're trying to revive Kwenn back to a place where the activity was revitalized and people wanted to spend time there and the economy would grow and stuff like that. And that lasted for a while, and obviously Kwenn has come back to a state where it's forgotten about, and they're trying to figure out why that was. Like, what made companies leave there? What made the people want to leave there? Stuff like that. Ultimately, they determined it had a bit to do with crime in the area. It's close to the Slice, which is a Hutt-controlled space, and a lot of criminal activity that took place in that region of space. So another part of the book is where you have a faction called the Rift Walkers. There's a person within the faction that's acting as a helper of sorts, and she actually happens to be a Jedi on the High Council, but they don't know that. They just know her as Hotwire, and she's hired help to help with errands and things that will advance the Rift Walkers agenda, which at the moment is obviously making as much money as they can. And Delastra, who is the leader of the Rift Walkers, decided to run a little scheme where she would convince the other factions in the area that the Regal series of vessels, the same one that Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan were writing on earlier, were willing to pay the different factions in the Slice to where they wouldn't attack their ships, and in response they weren't allowed to attack any of them, and if any of the factions did, then the deal was off. They wouldn't receive any money. So Delastra put together a scheme to steal a bunch of these cases that were indestructible. You couldn't scan within them. They were very important cases that were able to hold large value items, so that way they couldn't open them and they couldn't see what was inside them, because they need to be opened with a spoken code that the owner can change. She has a meeting with these different faction leaders. The Jedi, this is Deepa Billaba. You might remember her from the beginning of Bad Batch, because I believe she appears there, and she is the master of Kanan Jarrus, then known as Caleb Doom. She is also the former Padawan of Mace Windu. She is present to this meeting between Zalastra and these other gang leaders. Zalastra sends these cases to these different gang leaders, and she claims that this is their payment for not attacking the Regal series. However, she has explosives within these cases. Upon explaining to them that there is a special droid that's going to speak this code to open the cases, she actually shouts out the code, which opens all the cases, and they explode on opening, except for hers. Then all the transmissions go off. Those leaders are presumed dead. Zalastra reveals that she knew Deepa was a Jedi. I don't know how she knew, probably because of how she acted during this happening. And she then opened her case, Zalastra's case, her last case, and revealed that she had Deepa's lightsaber. She then imprisons Deepa and holds her in like a torture field or something like that, where she holds her suspended, and there's gas within the room where she's delirious and she can't think and she has no strength and she's on the verge of dying, basically. Kyla, who is this little thief character that belongs to the Riftwalkers, and she's just like a young girl that the Riftwalkers use to get into tight spaces and steal things, basically. She becomes scared because she helped get these cases, and then the cases killed a bunch of people. So now she feels responsible for killing all these people, and she doesn't really want to be a part of it anymore. So while Zalastra is holding Deepa hostage, Kyla is able to escape her watch and steals a comlink to communicate with the Jedi and with the Republic that, hey, Zalastra has a Jedi from the High Council here, you need to come help. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon hear the message, and so does Mace Windu, who is currently aboard a ship called the Assurance, with the captain of that ship is named Pel Balo. And they have a lot of banter and a lot of discussion throughout the book, and they're kind of a fun little couple that work together throughout the book. So Mace and Pel, with the Assurance, arrive at the compound that Deepa is being held at by the Riftwalkers. So does Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, because they hear the transmission. They were actually on their way to Kwenn, I believe, but then they deviated and went to this compound. The Assurance fired on the compound to try to get people out. Deepa was released from her suspension that she was in because of the damage that was taking place. She had to try to get out. Zalastra was trying to get out. Zalastra is able to take Kyla hostage, and she tries to tell the Jedi. They confront each other at one point when they're out of the compound, and she tells the Jedi that Deepa is dead, but then Deepa appears out of nowhere and says, nope, I'm not dead. And then while taking Kyla hostage, she says, I'm going to kill her if you don't let me out of here, basically. So she negotiates her way out. She promises that she won't attack the Jedi on her way out, and that she wouldn't attack any other Jedi, but obviously the Jedi know not to trust her. So they then investigate her a little bit further, and they find some video recordings of her while she imprisoned Deepa, and noticed some clues involving a hand of Sabacc cards, which are all the idiot card from the Sabacc deck, and there's 11 of them, and there's 11 Jedi Council members that went to Kwenn. So they believe that she has intention of going to Kwenn and killing the Jedi, and by doing this, she wants to take over Kwenn with the leaderless factions of the people that she just killed, and conquer it and secede it from the Republic so they can become a part of the Slice, and with a couple other planets that she has control over, and basically create a new controlled criminal space that rivals the Hutts and puts her at the top of the food chain, basically, in criminal activities. She travels to Kwenn to accomplish just this. She basically has a case that's hidden under this arena that the other Jedi are having an assembly at, basically, and a case is set up to respond to a certain phrase, and she believes that the Jedi are going to utter this while they're speaking to this crowd in this arena, and the phrase is, the Jedi stand with you. Deepa learns of this phrase, though. I think she basically guessed it because she learned of how Zalastra is. Explained to the Jedi, don't say this phrase during the arena because it's going to blow up this case. She foils her plan. Zalastra narrowly escapes and survives for a little bit longer, but she eventually hides the case at like the Jedi Outpost. Deepa and Kyla find themselves there. They find out that it's there. They try to go find the case, but then Deepa advises against it and said, we just have to get out of here because she's going to blow it up, basically. So they get out. Zalastra blows it up. She's waiting for her ship to come take her away, but didn't realize that that ship was hijacked by Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and a few other people that she was going to blow up earlier in the story that belonged to her faction, basically, that she kind of felt were not valuable, I guess. She's then imprisoned, and the Jedi are questioning her, why did you have this plan to attack the Jedi? What was your goal here? And Zalastra revealed a story that, and she revealed it earlier in the book, but she had a story from her childhood that involved her childhood friends getting taken away by the Jedi because they were deemed as Force sensitive to come join the Jedi. Jedi explained, well, that is something normal that happens, and we're sorry that happened. But then Zalastra said, well, they were taken without any regard for my well-being or their family's well-being or anybody in the area. And Jedi were like, well, that's not normal. They reveal that they have services that help family out after that child is taken to help them cope and help them move on. And then they also take the family's choices well into account before they actually make that decision, and as well as the child's too, if the child is old enough to decide if that's something they want. There's a lot of things that are taken into account before they actually recruit a child into the Jedi. That does not calm Zalastra down at all. She still hates the Jedi, but it was good that the Jedi were able to explain that, and it created a good explanation in the book anyway for anybody reading. Then she's taken to a high security prison. Everybody celebrates that that was foiled and that the Kwenn celebration was somewhat successful because she wasn't really able to accomplish anything she wanted to accomplish on the planet. And the Jedi Council make their way back and decide that the trip was very beneficial. They were able to get back in tune with helping local communities, and a lot of the Jedi talked with people on Kwenn while they were there and just worked with communities on different things. There were people that had different struggles and different things going on that they were able to connect with and try to help people discuss and talk through. Kept a lot of that content because it's just a lot of, I wouldn't say it was filler, not anything that seemed like it was central to the plot or anything. It basically just outlined, when I said that the Jedi were rehumanized in this book, that's where it happened, with these interactions between the Jedi High Council and the people of Kwenn. That was good to read. It was fun to read. The characters became deeper in this book. Backstories are great. I almost felt like the book was underrated as I was reading it, because there were times where I struggled to stay engaged in the book, and not because it's a bad book. When I become interested in a book, the things that draw me in are things that have a strong connection to the upcoming stories and the official stories. For instance, like episode 4, Obi-Wan Kenobi was talking to Luke Skywalker, and Luke said, "You fought in the Clone Wars?" And then Obi-Wan said, "Yeah, I was a Jedi Knight just like your father." They talked about the Clone Wars, and everybody heard that, and they don't know what that means, but that's something that George could expand upon. So then obviously there's a whole series that I would say half the prequels had to do with that one mention. You had the mention of the Clone Wars in one movie, and that sparked the entire procession to the original trilogy. So it's cool to see those kinds of things get expanded upon in other works, and that's where this one didn't hold up as much as I would hope it did. It doesn't make it a bad story. It was still a fun story. It's just I want to see that stronger connection. But now we'll go into the more interesting things that I found in the book. Qui-Gon is a big believer in the living force, what's going on right in front of you, and he explains that to Obi-Wan when they're on the ship in the beginning of the book, the Regal Zephyr, and Obi-Wan says, "I have trouble connecting with common people." And Qui-Gon didn't like the fact that he called them common people because he felt like they all were valuable in themselves and they were on the same level. Jedi aren't above those people, and those people aren't above the Jedi. He viewed them as equals. And he told Obi-Wan, "This is why I like to take public transportation, because then I get a chance to connect everyday people, and I get to hear about their struggles so I can see how I could help one or two people that are right in front of me each day and every day." So that was really what sparked the book, and it was an interesting anecdote to hear from Qui-Gon. One thing that disagrees with my assessment about this book is that the closure of a lot of these Jedi outposts seems like it had to do with the fall of the Jedi leading up to episode 3. The outline here is that it speaks to how absent the Jedi were from common everyday people in planets that really needed their individual attention. So because of that, a lot of people had negative views about the Jedi because they feel like they didn't care. Because of so many people taking on this perception of the Jedi, when episode 3 came along and Order 66 was given, then a lot of people in the galaxy agreed that the Jedi were an enemy of the people. Not everybody, but a lot of people. And it's because of this perception that they fostered by enacting these Jedi outpost closures. And they're not solely responsible for that, but it definitely helps spark that later on. There's a Zabrak that's on the Jedi Council, and his name is Eth Koth. I was confused when I saw that because I thought that all Zabraks were from Dathomir, but this Zabrak is from Iridonia, and I feel kind of silly now because there was a book that said that Darth Maul was from Iridonia, and I laughed it off and said, "Hey, he's not from Iridonia, he's from Dathomir," which I still think he is from Dathomir. At least in the canon section of Wikipedia, it does explain that Eth Koth is an Iridonian Zabrak male, so I'll have to do some more research on Iridonia, I guess. Palpatine makes a few small appearances in this book, and there's a comment that he makes that hints at his Sith identity. It was just kind of funny to read. It basically goes like this. Senator from Naboo leaned over and handed her a datapad. "Here's a list of moves we have recommended so far, Master Gallia. I will give it my full attention." But instead, Addie Gallia, her eyes went somewhere else. Not to the discussion, nor even the vessels flying outside the great rectangular window. Leaning over to Palpatine, she covered her mouth to speak confidentially and gestured to the walls. "Why this shade of blue? There's no accounting for taste," Palpatine whispered. "I sometimes wonder what it would look like in red." We all know Ki-Adi-Mundi is a Syrian male that has a very, very large head, almost like a cone head from the Coneheads, if you know that movie. Wow, I'm dating myself. That's an old movie. I was born way after that, but anyway. And the quote goes like this. "Yarael harumpt. Nonsense. We can afford to give the children something new and tailored to them." Ki-Adi-Mundi raised an eyebrow at Obi-Wan. "My friend has never liked secondhand clothing. Trouble with the fit. We could talk about you and helmets," Yarael responded, putting his hands together in a cone mimicking the one atop Ki-Adi-Mundi's head. The children laughed, and when Obi-Wan saw that Ki-Adi-Mundi didn't mind the joke, the Padawan grinned as well. I liked this scenario for a couple reasons. One, because it showed a situation where somebody was literally body shamed and he was willing to laugh it off and laugh at himself. And this is the second reason. It's a good lesson to learn that even though there might be imperfections about you, there's no problem with laughing it off, and it's not something to take too seriously. And I like that the book took this position and offered that as a solution for people that might be insecure about things like that. John Jackson Miller does a really good job of showing a scenario where the Jedi realize that they have changed drastically from the days of the High Republic. And you could see it in the High Republic books, but the Jedi were definitely giving individual attention to much more communities than the Jedi of the prequels. So this is nicely set up if you read those stories and kind of compare and contrast them. But it goes like this. Ki-Adi-Mundi nodded deferentially. "It is true, stories of Jedi who are isolated from the Order have always fascinated him, and his master too, if I recall. Good could be done with our cares of state, but members of the Jedi Council are capable of considering the galactic and the local. Indeed, it is our job." Ceci shrugged. "This is classic Qui-Gon, nothing new." "I disagree," Mace said, pausing a moment as he mused. "This was different. We are different." Mace was explaining to them that the Jedi Order and the Jedi Council has changed, and they've taken on the role more of big picture galactic problem solver and peace restorer rather than visiting communities personally and trying to help solve issues in person, face to face. And this is what the Jedi used to do 200 years ago. In episode 7, there's a character that gets some attention, is introduced as an important character because she possesses the lightsaber of Luke Skywalker somehow, where people thought it was lost because it dropped down a corridor in the Cloud Cities and just ends up in Maz Kanata's hands. And I know there's some stories that have explained that. I don't remember if I read them yet. She gets a brief mention in this book. Deepa had committed to remedy that lack of information. There was no question of his single Jedi, even a member of the Jedi Council, bringing a multi-planet operation like the Riftwalkers to justice. But the leader of such a group could not remain a cipher. Maz Kanata, who had ruled from her castle for centuries, had known that a pirate state was not always the worst neighbor to have. Whether a Queen Zalastra would be another Maz was in the vital security interests of the Republic to know. I admit I didn't do my homework on Maz Kanata to know what they're talking about with being a ruler in a castle for centuries. I do remember Maz being old, but obviously this would have taken place after her so-called rule, and I would like to know more details about that if I could do some more research. There's certain eras and events that acquire names after they are finished or after they take place, and a lot of times those names aren't given until well after that time period has ended. So the Jedi in this book mention the High Republic a lot, and they're referencing 200 years ago, at least members that would have lived that far back, but they mention a ship that existed during the High Republic era called the Arc 8, and he just said during the High Republic era. I didn't know if he meant 200 years prior or if he meant 100 years prior. I don't know when he meant. So when did the High Republic officially end? Was it just during the Acolyte, basically after those events? I guess we'll find out when that series ends, because at the time of this video, episode 7 has aired tonight, which I have not viewed yet. But yeah, when did it end? The book started with Qui-Gon telling the Jedi Council that it had an image problem, that public perception was bad of the Jedi, and that's why they needed to get out and work with people personally so they could get back in touch with people. Once Qui-Gon died to Darth Maul, they lost this very needed reminder of staying in touch with the common person. And I think that only exacerbated their furthering into this holding up in the council chambers, centralizing on Coruscant, not as many Jedi going out, or especially Jedi of the High Council going out and completing missions on behalf of the Jedi so people could see Jedi of prominence helping the local communities. The little thief Kyla that belongs to the Riftwalkers makes a statement in this book, and it struck me really hard when I read it, and both in terms of Star Wars lore and in real life. I just wanted to share it. It goes like this: I don't think I want to trust the judgment of anyone who isn't tied to other people. That gives an entirely new perception of the Jedi altogether in any era. I don't want to trust anyone that has no attachment or is not tied to other people. And basically what she's saying is, if you don't have any loyalty to somebody, how can you be trusted to be interested in helping me? Because now it seems like you're only out to help yourself because you don't hold any loyalty to one person. It's a weird thing to think about. You understand why the Jedi can't have attachments because of how they operate, but that's a really strong statement and it holds a lot of truth. Yarael Poof is an older member of the Jedi Council, one of the ones that lived for centuries basically, and he's the one that kind of looks like a Kaminoan when you look at the Jedi Council in episodes 1, and I don't know if he appears in episode 2 or 3, but you'll notice his long neck, a lot like the Kaminoans. It mentions in this book that people who have lived for centuries, especially Yarael, has become bored because of how long they've lived, and they often have to entertain themselves by doing different things, by taking on different personalities just to see how people react. It was just kind of funny to see that if you live so long, you really have to take on different strategies of what's the point of continuing to live, basically, which is kind of funny for a Jedi to think that. I mean, their point is to keep the peace and help people. They're there to help people. Maybe he's helped so many people that he's bored of it now. Kwenn in the book is introduced as a planet of large significance to a lot of the Jedi High Council members. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but when you have a story that takes place directly before an official episode of Star Wars, if we're talking about that, or directly after, you expect it to have a strong connection to that official story. This one doesn't really, with the exception of how the public perception of the Jedi have changed and how that may affect them later in episode 3, and I argue that it probably did affect it a lot. With the planet Kwenn being mentioned so much by the Jedi, if it's such an important place to them and it held strong significance, it felt like, if that's the case, why isn't it mentioned in episode 1? And obviously because the idea hasn't been presented yet, but that's the risk you take with introducing new things that people hold value to that take place before other stories where they don't mention it at all. If it was valuable, they would have mentioned it later. That's what would have happened. Maybe it wasn't mentioned because it was kind of a forgotten place because they talked about it 200 years ago. So there's that too, but it is risky to bring things into play in that nature. Reading all the interactions that the Jedi have with people on Kwenn, it's the most human that I've ever seen the Jedi be described, and you don't really see that many interactions of them with common people on any planet, really. And we're talking about people that spend every day at the market or that work regular jobs, kind of like anybody in the United States or in the world. It's very interesting to read how human they really are, or at least how they can connect with people that live those everyday lives, even though they've been holed up on Coruscant for so long. So it was neat to see the humanization of some of these Jedi. When Zalastra comes up with her plan to take control of Kwenn and make it a part of the Slice and secede it from the Republic and create this criminally controlled space, it felt like the Nile, honestly, from the High Republic. I thought that the story was going to go to Zalastra having a connection to people in the Nile, which would have made a lot of sense, but they didn't go that direction. They didn't say anything about it. It seemed like a mirror image of that faction, basically. The Jedi definitely abuse the Jedi mind trick a lot in this book, and they use it a ton of times, and it makes you wonder, is it inappropriate how much they're using it? At one point, one of the Jedi basically uses it on somebody several times in a row just to get him to get away, basically. Every time he uses it, the person is like, wait a minute, why would I want to do that? And then he tells him to do something else. Oh, okay. Wait, I can't do that. You know, it just keeps changing his mind. So it definitely points to the earlier description I had of the Jedi mind trick, where it's supposed to suggest something that the person then has as if it's their own thought, but then they rethink it and say, wait, I shouldn't be doing that. They just use it so many times in this book. You're like, probably shouldn't do that. At one point in the book, in order to fight their way on Kwenn and foil Zalastra's plan, Deepa needed a lightsaber because Zalastra had her lightsaber in that case that she had. So Mace loaned her his lightsaber to follow Zalastra and attempt to fight her, basically. And it just led me to think, is that in character for Mace? Would he loan out his lightsaber even to his former Padawan, who was a Jedi Master on the Council? Probably, maybe. It also seems like he's so principled that seems out of character for him. I just don't see that happening, but it happened. So obviously, canonically, it is in character with him, but it seemed weird at first. And the last thing I found interesting, I also touched upon earlier, and that's that this book really dives into how the Jedi recruit children into the Jedi Order to become Jedi and how they handle that process and how it's a delicate process. And they take the family's choices into account. If possible, they take the child's choice into account. They provide services to the families during and after the process has taken place. There's probably a lot of people that know what the Jedi do in terms of almost like kidnapping, it seems like, but they don't realize everything that goes into it. So it was cool that the book outlined and described the things that do go into it, because it makes it seem like a much more innocent process than it may have been viewed as before. Post video edit, it dawned on me that I did not give a rating for this book. It was a really decent read. It wasn't one of the greatest books I read. I really did enjoy this story. I just, like I said, I appreciate when you have books that expand on previously mentioned story aspects, has a strong connection to the upcoming story or the previous story. When you get into side stories that introduce new things, it's fun and it's interesting. It doesn't leave me as connected to it as if I could relate it to other things that it could expand upon. So due to that, I decided to give it an 8.1. And again, because it's a good story, just didn't fulfill my entire criteria of what it fully engages me into a book. So I hope everybody enjoyed the book. I hope everybody enjoyed the takes that I had on it. And I appreciate every single person that stopped by today. And may the Force be with you and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.